I am Sebastian Kwamena Tettey, and I'm talking to you from Cape Coast, Central Region, Ghana, West Africa. At this moment, I am in a building called Cape Coast Castle, which was built by the British in 1665. And it's about 352 years, but it's actually the youngest and the smallest of the three castles we have in this very country. You know, with the castles, the first and the biggest one was built by the Portuguese, 1482. As a normal trading post, so there was nothing like a dungeon in it. It rather had storage spaces where they held gold, ivory, spices, and several other materials, with a church built outside the castle. But around 1600s, it was relocated to the courtyard of the castle because of several attacks from the Dutch for safety's sake. But that is where transatlantic slave trade began in the mid-15th centuries. You know, there's another castle in Accra, which is the capital of Ghana, called Osu Castle, or Christiansborg Castle. It was built by the Danish in 1661. It's about 356 years, which is the second biggest and the second oldest. And where I am now is Cape Coast Castle, which was built by the British, 1665, which is about 352 years, the youngest and the smallest. But if you're looking for the biggest slave castle in the whole of West Africa, that is Cape Coast Castle, because it was built when transatlantic slave trade was at the highest level. So the dungeons in Cape Coast Castle held at least 1,300 people to maximum 1,500 people. And the people were not all Ghanaians. They came in from several parts of Africa. And if they came in from several parts of Africa, majority of them were taken from West Africa. But as they took them from West Africa, they had to walk from several places. Talk of Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and several other places. They walked all the way down to the fort. And as they got to the fortress, before they sent men and women to the dungeons of the castle, each group of them that arrived here were owned separately by other European companies. That is why the companies had to give their captives marks. By marking them, they were putting metals with initials of the companies on them into fire. It turns red. Then they will use the red hot metals to brand the captives, either on the chest, either on the hand, or on the back, to show that these people are for this person before they were dispersed into the dungeons. Men in the male dungeon, women in the women's dungeon. And in the dungeons, they spent at least 2 weeks or 3 months waiting for ships to come and convey them from West Africa to the Americas and Europe. Majority of the captives that arrived here were actually brought in by Africans. And I want you all to know that that is something as Africans we don't really want to talk about. But that does not mean the Africans were very much aware of what was going on. All they knew was the Europeans were taking their folks out there to work for them, and which was the same thing that existed amongst the African settlers because of indentured servitude that went on amongst Africans before the Europeans arrived here. And with the indentured servitude, it was more like fishing, farming, construction work, and everything. And whenever a servant had a child, the child never became a servant. On the other hand, these people had good places to sleep, decent food to eat, and everything. Things went on well for them. But when the Europeans came in and said they needed people to work for them also, the Africans started giving them some of their African brothers and sisters. And when they started giving out, all they needed in exchange was the gunpowder, mirrors, like an handful of smoking pipes, whiskey, rum, teacups, ceramic plates, and everything, because they were practicing the barter system. But with the tribal leaders, most importantly, they were interested in gun and gunpowder the more. Because the more of it they had, the more powerful they became during an intertribal war. And the more powerful they became, the more intensified the wars. The more intensified the wars, the more people they got. And the more people they got, the more people they brought to the Europeans. You know, the more people the Europeans received, the more motivated they became in supplying arms to the local people. So the cycle actually never ended. It went on and on and on and on. And transatlantic slave trade actually went on for about 400 years. What am I trying to tell you? I'm trying to tell you that at a point in time, Africans came to realize what was really happening. But you know, some people decided to stop doing the business with the Europeans, but others still went ahead and did the business anyway because they were making lots of profit from everything. But hey, you can find people like that everywhere in the world. It's even going on today. People don't want to stop doing something even though it's very wrong. They still go ahead and do it anyways, just because they are enriching themselves with everything. Well, where we are set as an auction block or a market, and it's called Palava Hall. This was the very place the Europeans were auctioning off gold, ivory, spices, African men, African women, and everything. They auction off everything here, and after they send the captives to the courtyard of the castle where they were branded before they were dispersed into the dungeons where they stayed there awaiting ships to come and convey them through the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. And that is what we call the transatlantic slave trade. You know, with the transatlantic slave trade, when it began, another trade called triangular trade emerged. And with the triangular trade, it was between 3 continents. And if I'm talking of 3 continents, I'm talking of Europe, Africa, and the Americas, where Europeans were bringing gun, mirrors, second-hand clothes, smoking pipe, whiskey, rum, ceramic plates, bent bricks, lime powder, pitch pine wood, and everything, all the way down to Africa. And all these materials they brought was used in balancing the ships all the way down to Africa. Whenever they came to Africa, they used these materials to get African men, African women, gold, ivory, spices, and other valuables, which they took from Africa straight to the Americas. And as I said earlier, they used these materials to balance the ships from Africa to the Americas. When they made it to the Americas, the only cargo they left there happens to be African men and women. They rather needed the gold in Europe. So African men and women were left on the fields to work the fields, growing sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, and other things. And after from there, they would send sugar, coffee, tobacco, and other things to Europe to feed the industries out there, which was also used in balancing the ships to Europe. This is what we call the triangular trade. But the movement from Europe to Africa was known as the outward passage. From Africa to the Americas was the middle passage, and the Americas to Europe was known as the inward passage. Well, there is an exhibition going on in the facility now called the Inchin installation. The word Inchin means twist and turn. So let's say twist and turn installation. And all these cultures you're looking at represents the very Africans that were taken from Africa to the Americas. And if all these represent the very Africans that were taken from Africa to the Americas, well, the person that did this is called Kwame Akotobamfo. And Kwame Akotobamfo did 10 years of research to come up with the real faces of the real people that were mostly taken from West Africa to the Americas. That is why we have all of these here. And the exhibition began on the 17th of June. It's going to end on the 7th of April 2018. So wonderful guests witness a part of the exhibition. And we have all these pieces of sculptures broken up. In real life, anything that is broken means that thing is either dead or destroyed. So the broken pieces here with nets around it represent the very people that lost their lives and got thrown into the sea from the dungeons of the castle and from the ships that carried them to the Americas. You know, we have a net around them representing that they used the net to get the dead ones out of the sea. That is why we have them here like that. But we have tons of other places to see in this very facility. That is why I'm going to take you straight to the male slave dungeons in Cape Coast Castle where African men were held. Well, wonderful people, I told you I was going to take you to the male dungeons in Cape Coast Castle. Well, we are almost down there in the male dungeon. But when we get really, really down there, the place is pitch black. It's very dark in there, so you're not going to see clearly. So let me show you all these things properly. Please follow me. As you were entering, you saw the light, but I turned it off. And since I've turned the light off, you can see how this place looks like. This is the male dungeon. This is how dark it looks like. And the light you see at the top is the only light you're going to see in this room. That's the only source of light and ventilation for the male captives that stay in the male dungeon here in Cape Coast Castle. If the light comes up, you're going to see that it's a different place altogether. Let me have a possible. This is the male dungeon. And the male dungeon has got about 5 rooms in it, designed for only African men, about 1,000 of them maximum. So with the 5 rooms, it means each room was holding about 200 people. And this was exactly where they were sleeping. 200 in each room. They had wooden buckets in each room as well. And if you want to defecate, you have to move from where you are to the bucket to defecate in it. But movement to the bucket was always a problem. Why is that? It is so because the men in here, all of them were in shackles and chains for about 3 months. At the same time, the holes on the building, which served as source of light and ventilation, had no nets covering it. So it was open. And since it was open, there were flies that always entered the dungeons. So sometimes you find amongst the men, there are some of them that have diarrhea, dysentery, malaria fever, and other things. They will try making an effort going to the bucket, but they will end up defecating on themselves along the way. So mostly, these men decided to stay where they were. They would defecate, urinate, and sleep at the very same place. They were fed twice a day in the palm. Food that was given to them was nothing to satisfy anybody, but just to keep them going from time to time. And the thing is, as they ate in their palm, the hands wasn't washed. Because they were staying in the dungeons for about 3 months without taking a shower. So who's going to wash their hands when they're just going out there to eat in their palm? Because of all these things, at some point when you come into the dungeon, you find some of the men dead in the dungeons. And as they found some of the men dead in the dungeons, they would just pick the dead bodies up, take them out of here, send them onto the sea and drop the bodies. And they didn't just drop the bodies, but they had to tie them up with cannonballs and drop them so that they would sink and they would not come ashore. Aside all of these things, the Europeans did not only come to Africa to trade, they also came to Africa to spread the gospel, just to counteract the Arabs from spreading Islamic religion all over Africa. That is why in all of the numerous forts and castles built along the coast of West Africa, there were churches built in them. So in Cape Coast Castle, there was a church built by the British right above the dungeon called the Church of England, which later became Anglican Church. The church sits above the dungeon. And as it sits above the dungeon, the Africans were here worshipping in Africa. The Africans were staying here, going through struggle and suffering. So as the Africans stayed here, went through struggle and suffering, the Europeans stayed up there preaching the gospel, love your neighbor as yourself, repent for the kingdom of God and everything. But on the building, we have spy holes. And with these spy holes, it served as a place where the European soldiers would stay and check on the captives all the time. But there is this particular one that is at the very entrance of the church. Please, see this from right here. So if you see right at the top, you can see the hole. And that hole you see there happens to be the spy hole at the entrance of the church I'm just talking about. The European soldiers will stay up there and check on the captives without coming down here to come into contact with feces, urine, food particles, and everything that was here, because it was very smelly. Every single captive that came here, when the Europeans took them to the Americas, they converted them into becoming Christians. And if they converted them to becoming Christians, majority of the captives that came here were Muslims. They were Muslims because the Arabs had already been to Africa to spread Islamic religion during trans-Saharan slave trade era. So that is why most of the churches that were built in the forts and castles on the coast of West Africa were either built closer to the dungeon or on top of a dungeon. Because when they are up there or closer to the dungeon, preaching the word of God, singing hymns and everything, the people in the dungeons, they get to hear it. It's more like the adverts of today. As you listen to the advert over and over again, as a human being, your system adjusts to the advert. Unless you don't watch it. And since the system adjusts to the advert, it's easy for the people to go out there and go for the product. So it's the same thing. When they listen to the hymns and everything, their system adjusts to it, they send them to the Americas, it's easy to convert them into becoming Christians. So it was very psychological. That is why Christianity and slave trade went on simultaneously in the castle for about 200 years. Well, the floor I am standing on at this moment isn't the original floor. Let me show you something on the floor. So you realize that on the floor, it's all covered up with something. Wonderful people, everything that I'm touching right now happens to be feces, urine, food particles and everything. Because at some point the Europeans decided to stop cleaning the dungeons. And whenever they sent people out of here to the courtyard, instead of servants coming to clean the place up, they were ordered rather to cover everything up with sand. And since they ordered people to cover everything up with sand, they brought the captives back to sleep on top of it. And so this happens to be the DNA of Africans that were taken out of the dungeons to the Americas. The DNA of your ancestors. The DNA of all of these people that struggled for months in these dungeons. And the Europeans made the Africans go through everything they went through just to break them. And whenever people died, they never cared. Why? Because whenever they bought people, they insured them. And if they insured them, whenever people died or survived, they still made money either ways. This is the last part of the male dungeon. And on this side, we have this very structure, which happens to be a shrine. Before the Europeans came to Africa, Africans believed in the existence of the Almighty God, whom they worshipped through lesser gods, believing that the spirit of the lesser gods lived in things of nature. And if I'm talking of things of nature, I'm talking of trees, mountains, rivers, and so many other things, which were considered very sacred. So behind the castle, there is a huge rocky mountain which served as a shrine. That was where the early settlers of this very vicinity worshipped. But as they worshipped there came a time in the year 1555, the Portuguese had been here. When they came here, they were interested in this very space. So the space was given to them by the chiefs. They were paying rent to the chiefs. So practically, they owned the space. That is why they made the chiefs remove the shrine from here. But since the huge rocky mountain was immovable, they only had to take pieces of it. And the pieces is what you see here now. And wonderful people, you know, this is still active. People come here to worship. Only that the stones you see here hasn't got the original color. It's covered in blood. And the blood is not that of a human, but that of animals they sacrifice here all the time. Behind this, we have this very thick wall you see here. And this thick wall has been used to cover up something. It's never a part of the original building. Behind it, we have a tunnel that connects the male dungeon and the door of no return. So the African men that were supposed to stay here, whenever the ships came, none of them was allowed to walk out through the courtyard. They were made to rather walk underground. And as they went through the tunnel late in the night, the heat trapped in there drained the men physically and emotionally. You're going to make it out there all right, but when you get there, you don't have the state of mind or the strength to even fight and free yourself. That is why it was very easy for them to be taken to the boats, from the boats to the ships, from the ships to the Americas. From the Americas, they never came back to Africa. Well, If you want to know of all the Africans that were taken from Africa, majority of them were taken out of Africa by the Portuguese, followed by the British. And out of 100%, the Portuguese were sending about 47%. The British, 26%. And most of the people the Portuguese were taking were being taken to Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, and other places, but majority ended up in Brazil. And if majority ended up in Brazil, that is why today Brazil has got a 54% black population, 46% white population. And in the whole of the world, Nigeria holds the biggest African population, but Brazil comes second in the world. And this is all because of transatlantic slave trade, which means there are even more blacks in Brazil than Ghana, where I am, which is an African country. Well, most of the people that went through Cape Coast Castle were from Ghana. And if they were from Ghana, you know, they started taking them from the northern part of Ghana all the way down to the south. And, you know, they went through this castle directly to places like Jamaica, Grenada, and I'm talking of British Guyana as well as Bahamas, Trinidad, Barbados, South and North Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Virginia, Charleston, and all of these other places. That is why when you come around this area in Ghana, if you are an African living out there, you walk around, you see people that have got features of people you know back home around this area. There's an evidence of what actually went on. Well, you can't see parts of the tunnel from here, but when we go out, you're going to see parts of the tunnel there. So let me take you outside, let's see parts of the tunnel, and let's continue to talk from there. Where I'm sitting right on top of the underground tunnel I talked about. And as I said, the tunnel connects the male dungeon and the door of no return. So the African men will walk underground all the way through the tunnel. But as they walked in the tunnel, European soldiers were not there with them. They rather stood up here and checked on the captives. And as the captives went through, there were African overseers that held whips and made sure they were moving through. So let me show you a part of the tunnel from here. This is a part of the underground passage. And as the men will be walking through, European soldiers will be up here with their guns checking on them from here. And there's about 20 feet drop. But we are going to see parts of it on the other side as well, because it's very dangerous. If anything falls down there, we are not getting it back, because I am not going for it. So let's go to the other end. Oh. We saw part of the tunnel from the male dungeon. We went to the top of the tunnel, but there's another portion on the side of the tunnel where European soldiers will stand with a gun checking on the captives as they move through this very underground passage. And you know, whenever the captives got out of the tunnel, they get to the door of no return. And as I told you, the heat in this tunnel drained them. Whenever they got to the door of no return, they never had the energy to fight and free themselves, judging by the fact that it was at that point, that was where they were leaving Africa and never coming back to Africa. So we'll say that that was their moment of truth. Hey, right in front of the door, I know you saw a cell. But you know, this cell you saw was actually designed for European soldiers. There were European soldiers that got drunk and misbehaved most of the times in the castle. Well, they had to be checked. By checking them, they were made to stay right there a few hours. They gave them food, water. They had lights, they had ventilation. Whenever they were sober, they were allowed to go. But there were African men. They were so strong that they always tried getting out of the shackles and chains. They tried getting out of the dungeons of the castle as well as the castle. At some point, the Europeans became fed up with these men. They would beat them up to become very weak. They would put them in shackles and chains. They would bring them into this very room. You know, in this room, as they stayed, they never had food, water, light,
ventilation, nothing. They stayed here until they lost their lives. And as they lost their lives, they picked up dead bodies, threw them into the sea. To serve as an example to the others in the dungeons that they can't get up and misbehave just as they did. But you know, whenever they brought the people here, because there was no light, there is no way you're going to see the face of a brother or a friend. You're going to hear people singing, talking, and other things just to console themselves, but then if care is not taken, whatever they say, you will not understand because of language barrier. The next thing you realize the whole place is very quiet. You stretch your hand, you touch someone. That body you touch is lifeless. And until the last person dies here, nobody walks out of here. Which means if you are here, you're not dead, your friends are dead with you, you still stay with the dead bodies until you die. And maximum 3 days, the strongest person is going to pass out because there is no ventilation. How do you breathe? There is no water. How do you hydrate after dehydrating? Let me quickly walk out and turn off the light so you see how it looks like in here. So you just saw how dark it was when I turned off the light, wonderful people. That is what the African men had to stay in the condemned cell for maximum 3 days and lost their lives. Well, there's a place in this castle called the Door of No Return. That is the point where all men and women lost their identity, lost everything in terms of dignity, property, family, everything was lost. Because from here, they were taken to the Americas. And over there, they were given new identity. Everything was new. Only that some of them held on to their culture. They never lost it. But majority of them lost it.
Let me take you to see female punishment cell in Cape Coast Castle. There were some African women that tried escaping from the castle. They were so strong enough that they never allowed the Europeans to abuse them sexually. At some point, the Europeans become fed up with these African women. They would just bring them into this very small room with a very heavy door, locking the place up. The African women get to stay here for 1 week or 10 days. They give them food and water once a day as a punishment. And as they stayed here, they defecated and urinated right here in this very hole. They urinated and defecated right here in this very hole. And at the same time, the food and water came in through this hole right here. This was the source of light and ventilation. And you know, the women just had pieces of cloth around their waist. And in general, men, women had pieces of cloth around their waist. So what is going to happen at that time of the month when these women are supposed to menstruate here? There were heavy flowers and all of that. How will that be done? So you realize that it felt really uncomfortable for all of these Africans that stayed in the dungeons of the castles for about 3 months before the Europeans moved them from Africa to the Americas. Let me take you to see the women's dungeon and have the experience from the women's dungeon as well.
Hello. We've been to the male dungeon, we've seen part of the tunnel. Now we are in the women's dungeon. The women's dungeon was designed for African women only. And the male dungeon and the women's dungeon is about 100 meters apart from each other. But with the women's dungeon, we have 2 separate rooms designed the same. And each of them held 250 African women, maximum, to the bro. These women also were sleeping, they were defecating, urinating, menstruating here. Food and water was given to them twice a day as well, just like the men. But hey, both
both men and women just had pieces of cloth around their waist. Which means the women here were almost naked and they had menstruate on themselves here with no sanitary towels or anything. But on top of that, they were raped by the Europeans because they were not bringing women along with them. As they raped them, they were taking them to the shore to wash them up with seawater, to clean up the feces, urine, food particles, feces and everything on them before they were brought to the courtyard of the castle. They got fresh water from there to wash them up before they even raped them. And after raping them, they brought them back into the dungeons. But there were times where they found some of these African women showing symptoms of pregnancy. Well, they had houses out of the castle where they took care of them there. They had their kids, and after having their kids, the mothers were made to stay there and take care of the children. Whereas the kids were at some point given education, judging by the fact that whenever they brought in European soldiers, they died quickly, so much so that West Africa was named White Man's Grave. So if that is the case, it's best for them to rather educate the children to grow up and become just like them, and then they work for them in the companies and the castle as well. There are some women, when they come here, they will be like, well, if I were here, I'll just get myself pregnant and get out of here. But it wasn't always like that. Because sometimes you might be pregnant here, you will not be found pregnant here, you might be found pregnant on board a slave ship en route to the Americas. If you are found pregnant on board a slave ship en route to the Americas, you are not going to make the journey. Because in most cases, they will just pick up innocent pregnant women and toss them into the sea. Why did they do this? Because when you make it to the Americas, you're going to become liability. And why am I saying she's going to become liability? You'll be there as a pregnant woman. You can't work. If you can't work, they have to give you food, clothing, shelter, medication, and everything. And that is going to be expensive. What is the guarantee that your baby is even going to survive? So it's best for them to throw them away. And I want you all to know that whenever the Europeans got captives in the castle, before they took them abroad, each and every captive that came here was insured. So if they had insured the captives, it means whether people died or survived, they still made their money anyways. That is why they never cared when people were dying. And everything they made our African ancestors go through in these dungeons of the castle was to break them, was to make them become servile. Well, majority of the Africans that were taken from Africa were taken by the Portuguese. And I'm saying they were taken by the Portuguese because out of 100%, the Portuguese took 47%, followed by the British, who took about 26% of our ancestors. And the Portuguese were sending people to Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, and other places, but majority of them were sent to Brazil. That is why today Brazil has got 54% black population, 46% white population. And in the whole of the world, Nigeria has got the biggest African population. But Brazil comes second in the world in terms of African population. And it's not even an African country. So this is the depth of which the Europeans went. Well, as I was saying, the British took the second highest, and majority of the captives that went through Cape Coast Castle were actually taken from Ghana. From the northern part of Ghana all the way down to the south. And they were sending them mostly to places known as Jamaica, British Guyana, Haiti, Trinidad, Barbados, Bahamas, as well as southern North Carolina, Charleston, Mississippi, Georgia, and other places. Wonderful people, as I said, I'm now taking you to the door of no return. That is the door right there. Originally very short and narrow, only one person was able to walk out of the door. As the African men in shackles and chains, as well as the women, walked out of the door, they lost it all. They were taken out there to the shore, and at the shore, there were boats waiting for them to carry them from Africa to the Americas. So, follow me. Let's go and see what happened
over there. Let's come.
All right, so I just brought you out of the door of no return, and wonderful people, you are at the moment looking at this very port, which was set as a port for the Europeans. So the Europeans had this whole place for themselves, and whenever the ships came, this happens to be the very stairs African men and women in shackles and chains used down. So they used the stairs all the way down to the shore, and whenever they got to the shore, the soil there was the last African soil they never touched in Africa. They sent them to the boats carried them to the ships took them away and never brought them back. But now, behind the door of no return, we have door of return there. So let me take you there. Let's go and see why we have door of return at the back of the door of no return. Right there you see door of return. This door of return was placed there around 1998. Come and let me tell you why. So it was made door of return in the year 1998 when Africans from the diaspora decided to make a return to Africa to celebrate their freedom officially. So officially they came to Africa to celebrate Emancipation Day, which was themed the Great Homecoming, 1998 on the first day of August. And on that day when they arrived in Africa at the Kotoka International Airport here in Ghana, Accra, they came out of the plane but they were not alone. They had 2 caskets with them. In the caskets there were skeletons of ex-slaves that were exhumed. One from Jamaica, Madame Christelle, one from New York, Samuel Carson. They brought them to a village on your way from Accra to Cape Coast called Abanze. And Abanze was a slave shipment area where we have Fort Amsterdam. Wonderful people, it was through that fort that lots of Ghanaians found themselves in Suriname. And you know, when you go to Suriname, some of the maroon villages, you will see some of these black people there that speak the language of this very place I am talking about. So after performing a short ceremony at that site, they decided not to bring the caskets by road again to the castle. They rather brought them to the castle by sea. And as they came by sea, they landed at the port which I just showed you. Right there, they carried the caskets, walked them up the stairs their ancestors used down and never used back up. They walked them through the door of no return, and immediately that work was done. The jinx of door of no return was broken to door of return, meaning all Africans that were taken away, even if all of them are dead today, their children can return to Africa and find their roots or wherever they were taken from. So that is why we have door of return at the back of the door of no return, and right here we have Akwaba, which means welcome. So wonderful people, even though you've not been here, but I know you're going to come here eventually. So I am in advance saying Akwaba to all of you, which means welcome. And whenever somebody says Akwaba to you, you better respond Medasi, which means thank you.